Hey guys, Tarke here, and I wanted to talk about curses over some B-roll of my reading Peter Rabbit to a Plant video that I uploaded on my channel a while ago. So how do I feel about curses now that we're a week into Expedition League and I've really messed around with the system? I'm mostly happy with the change. So obviously the main change I'm talking about is the changing so that you don't get 100% uptime of curse immunity from flasks. You now have it so that you just remove current curses on use. There are a couple of things which stand out as being kind of a problem, Hexfront and vulnerability map mods. I guess we'll start with Hexfront. I think Hexfront is mostly fine except for silence. I feel like I would probably remove silence from that because it just kind of stands out as a bit of an annoying problem one. I think if you remove silence from Hexfront, then just having a random rare mod whose whole thing is we just spam curses on you, I think that's kind of fine. I also like that they've made the change that you can now completely ignore map mods if you have 100% investment into reduced curse effect, which is very strong, and you can get incidental amounts of reduced curse effect either on the passive skill tree. I want to say Cluster Jaws, I'm not entirely sure about that, certain items, and Pantheon, so I like that. One thing that I saw, actually I'll get to that later, so then talking about vulnerability. Vulnerability, I think, is really the only map mod curse that could maybe use some attention, because it does stand out as being a lot more potent than the others when we talk about stuff like Enfeeble or Temp Chains or Elemental Weakness. So Elemental Weakness is a gear check. You can gear around it in multiple ways. You can either gear around it in terms of gearing around curse effect, you can gear around it in terms of just overcapping your resistances, or you can roll over it. So you have a few different ways of approaching it. So either overcap your resistances, cap for reduce curse effects, or use an item where it's like your resistances are set to certain values, stuff like that. Or yeah, just roll over it. So I think that's fine. Likewise with Enfeeble, for the most part, you can just run Enfeeble maps. Enfeeble might be a situation where if you have a Enfeeble map stacked up with a bunch of other things like Enfeeble, Monster Life, and then like increased resistance or something, then maybe that might be something you want to re-roll over, but I feel like Enfeeble is fine. Temp Chains I think is kind of fine. I know a lot of people hate Temp Chains, but it just kind of dampens your speed. I don't think it's that big of a deal. It's one of those things where certain builds are fast enough they can run Temp Chain maps and still feel good, or it's a situation of if you really hate it, you can just roll over it, and you can bypass it through going for curse reduction stuff. So I feel like there's enough ways to engage with Temp Chains, I think that's fine. Vulnerability though, vulnerability is very scary. Vulnerability has really been the main change in 3.15, where I've been like, okay, this feels hard. I've said quite a few times now that I've kind of struggled to really feel the nerfs that much. I definitely notice it when it comes to vulnerability. I'm someone who mostly plays acro, phase acro evasion based builds, and through removing Basalt Flask, having physical mitigation, those builds' weakest point was Physmit. They have ways of dealing with physical damage, but it's kind of gated behind lots of very end game options. There's not that many early game options to dealing with physical mitigation for those kind of builds outside of endurance charges, and I already run endurance charges on my build. And then, yeah, vulnerability is scary. I don't know if it's necessary that vulnerability is the issue, if the issue is the available to physical damage mitigation, or if the issue is the way that we can reduce curse stuff. So the ways that you can reduce curse stuff is tied to particular ascendancies, particular parts of the skill tree, or particular items. Outside of just Pantheon giving you a very small kind of bit. And a lot of that stuff is kind of tied into my problem with the availabilities of access to physical mitigation. So most of the physical mitigation on the skill tree is on the left-hand side of the skill tree. Most of the builds that really want physical mitigation are on the right-hand side of the skill tree. There are lots of endgame options when you talk about stuff like physical damage taken as elemental damage, or stuff like Divine Flash, but those aren't stuff you have access to early, and I kind of feel like there's enough options in the endgame, but they're a little too endgamey. I think I'd like to see the availability of that kind of be spread down a bit so that there's weaker values but easier access to it early, or just more tools being added in. Now, the problem with just flooding the game with lots of defensive tools is, while I would enjoy that a lot, the problem arises when you can just stack all the defensive tools, and that's where you have stuff like Fortify, which becomes a problem. Because you have developers who are like, okay, we're trying to solve a problem for a particular playstyle, say melee, which is the whole Fortify thing, by introducing survival tools for that build, the stronger builds, just add those into their builds. So suddenly, if you were just to flood a bunch of new physical mitigation options into the build, yes, it might help the builds that really struggle with physical mitigation, but it was also buff the builds that already have very strong physical mitigation. So there's a slight balancing act like that. I think a good way of getting around that is kind of what they did with guard skills. So with guard skills, they added a bunch of very strong defensive options all at once, but they made them exclusive. You can't use them all at the same time. And I think maybe they could revisit a few options like that and maybe reintroduce the basalt physical mitigation, but introduce something that's a little bit more right-hand side to the tree, which makes it hard to get to without very serious investment. Maybe something kind of like, they removed a lot of the stuff like blinded enemies deal less damage. There used to be a lot of just like generic damage reductions off the tree. They got rid of that. But maybe they could reintroduce something where like blinded enemies deal 4% less physical damage. I don't think that would necessarily be a massive problem. Or maybe on one of the Flask nodes, they could be like some physical mitigation while Flasks are active. I don't know. I think stuff like that could be kind of interesting, or like marked enemies deal less phys damage because there's marked stuff on the right-hand side of the skill tree. Make it something you need to invest into, but I think there could maybe be some options there. Now, one thing I did see, it was a tweet that Octavian put out, and I like the conclusion he came to, but I think he came to the wrong conclusion. So he was kind of talking about the whole curse thing, and he said, how about the idea that the warding suffix removes curses, but also gave you reduced cursed effect during it. So it's kind of like it removes any curses on you, and it gives you some curse mitigation. And I saw that and thought that's a great solution handled wrong. I think what could be interesting is instead of changing, like just buffing the warding suffix, what if they kind of did with what they did with the Aquamarine Flask, where you make a new flask which gives reduced curse effect while it's active. So that's its thing. You drink the flask, and while it's drunk, curses have less of an effect on you. And that would be very interesting. It'd be an interesting thing to add into self-curse builds. It could make their gearing more interesting. It could be something that maybe you roll up a very powerful curse flask. And then if you get like a alchemist curse flask with an instilling orb, maybe you can get 100% uptime, but then, you know, it's got a very short duration, or it's hard to maintain because of the flask charge generation. Maybe it'd be a situation where, yes, it's a very specialized flask you don't run all the time, but if you've rolled like 15 or 20 curse maps, you then bring along this handy flask, and then you run all your curse maps with that flask. And I think that's kind of the direction that GG wants to go in with the whole flask thing and slowing down the game, is making more considered, more specialist options that aren't universally always the best answer. And I think having a flask which was just like, this is the curse flask, I think that'd be a cool way of going about it, because you wouldn't necessarily have to use it. And I think that if they added it, I don't think that many people necessarily would even use it. But I think that'd be kind of interesting. So, I don't know. Let me know what you think about the state of curses in the current league. If, like me, you feel like vulnerability is the only one that kind of stands out. And on the just more general discussion on physical mitigation, right-hand side of the tree, let me know what you think there too. But yes, I'm Tarke. Have a good day. I will see you all on Baycast later today, by the way. Bye-bye.